Separated by two great oceans, the Old and New Worlds developed very different ecosystems of plants, animals, and microbes. Columbus's discovery of the Americas brought these continents back into contact and initiated a biological exchange between Africa, Europe, and the Americas that would rewrite this history of the world. Bringing previously isolated ecosystems together is much like lighting a match near an open can of gasoline. The Columbian Exchange had a lethal impact on New World people, plants, and animals, for the Old World had a distinct advantage in domesticated animals, weeds, pests, and almost everything else. European and African organisms swept across huge expanses of the Americas, quickly muscling out native plants and animals. European grasses, weeds, and rats spread like wildfire.
The discovery of the New World changed two worlds, changed the New World and the Old World. When we think of those amber waves of grain out there, those amber waves of grain were brought over by Europeans. They wanted to grow oats and barley and wheat and rye, and they brought those crops over, and here in this virgin land, those crops flourished. The swine flourished. They grew by the tens and thousands. The cattle flourished, and some of them went wild. You get your longhorns in Texas and other places. And the horses, some of those escaped, which has changed the plains culture of Indians. Instead of having to walk, you could have a horse, and they could cover wide areas. When I said fundamental change, I mean it. It literally remade both continents.
One of the most important kinds of contact, and was entirely unexpected, was the effect that European diseases had on these native peoples.
While the Americas were comparatively disease-free, Europe and Africa were loaded with them, and the age of Columbus was the age of infectious disease in Europe, an era ushered in by the Black Death of the 14th century. Exposed to infectious diseases for many centuries, Europeans and Africans had developed immunities that Native Americans lacked.
In time, they understood that the viruses that they were getting, deadly viruses, smallpox, diphtheria, things of that sort, they realized they were getting them from the Europeans, but there was no stopping it. There were no remedies. Whole tribes could be wiped out. It led to a huge depopulation of the Americas, so that for several centuries the population of the Americas kept going down and down and down as more and more Europeans arrived.
Using the growing colony of Hispaniola as a base, Spanish conquistadors, or conquerors, spread out through the Americas. They sailed north to Florida. They crossed Panama and saw the Pacific Ocean. They conquered the Aztecs in Mexico and the Incas in Peru. In search of the 7 cities of gold, they wandered deep into North America and sailed up the coast of California. And everywhere they went, disease either preceded or followed them. In 1519, Hernando Cortés led an army into the heart of Mexico. The Aztec Empire the Spaniards found there was large and powerful, and its capital city, Tenochtitlan, astonished the Spaniards.
I mean, some of these soldiers had actually fought in other wars that had taken them as far as Constantinople and certainly been to Rome, but they were unprepared for a city of that size and grandeur anywhere in the Americas.
At first, the Aztec leader Montezuma welcomed Cortés and his men. But after Spanish soldiers attacked worshippers at a religious ceremony, the Aztecs fought back. Though they vastly outnumbered the Spaniards, the Aztecs' weapons were no match for the armor, guns, cannons, and mastiffs of the conquistadors. The Spanish fought the Aztecs for more than a year, aided by other Mexican tribes eager to escape the cruelty and human sacrifice practiced by their Aztec rulers. But Cortés had another, more powerful ally: disease. Smallpox spread rapidly through central Mexico, the most densely populated region in the Americas. In less than 100 years, the population plunged from perhaps 25 million people down to a little more than 1 million.
the Europeans in carrying these diseases, and they didn't understand what was happening. But in carrying these diseases and seeing that somehow people are dying before them, were reinforced in their own idea of mission, that God has said, go forth and conquer this land. They carried with them as well this crusading idea that God expected them to go out and convert the heathen, and if not to convert them, at least to destroy them, so that they wouldn't stink in God's nostrils, to use a Christian phrase of the day.
Who can deny, wrote Oviedo, that the use of gunpowder against pagans is the burning of incense to our Lord? So many Native Americans died from cruel treatment, overwork, and disease that few people were left to harvest the riches of the Americas for the Spanish crown.
There simply wasn't enough population to work the new land, which was there in huge abundance. Consequently, they needed new population sources.
The Spaniards found the solution to their labor problem in West African slaves, who, because they came from environments similar to those of the Americas, had a greater resistance than Europeans and Indians to most contagious diseases.
They went for that huge reservoir of labor in Africa. It was available. There were Africans there who were willing to sell people from different tribes, and it started one of the most brutal, dehumanizing commerce in the world. This dealing in human flesh. We look back on it now, we wonder how it could have happened. So many millions of people enslaved and brutalized and brought to the New World.
By the 1520s, the Spaniards had also discovered that the American tropics were an ideal climate for the growing of the substance that Europeans craved more than anything else: sugar.
In some cases, and this is one of the ironies, the kinds of skills that Africans had of being able to work crops in a semi-tropical environment actually increased the rationale for enslaving those people rather than somebody else.
It was the New World sugar plantations, then, that fueled the greatest forced migration in modern world history. Over the next 400 years, close to 12 million West Africans were loaded onto slave ships for the Americas. Millions more died before they reached the boats. The trade in black gold wreaked havoc on Africa, disorienting and disrupting African societies and economies. In addition to the loss of millions, the trade in slaves led to the emergence of great slave-trading kingdoms like Dahomey and Ashanti, which waged war to capture men and women for sale to the Europeans.
Black gold came about as a new name for African slave labor. And they were called black gold because they were as valuable as gold, and in fact they came from the same region.
The majority of slaves exported from Africa were sent across the Atlantic Ocean, where they wound up on plantations in either Brazil or in the Caribbean.
In the following centuries, the interbreeding of Europeans, Africans, and Native Americans in the New World brought about the greatest mixing of the races in world history. In the Americas, Africans struggled to adapt to life under slavery. Torn from their homes in Africa, they tried to preserve their languages, religions, customs, and traditions. Africans, Europeans, and Native Americans all borrowed from each other, creating new cultures in the Americas. European cultivation of corn and potatoes would fuel an explosion in European population, contributing to the rapid growth in Europe's population after 1650, followed by increasing European migration to the Americas. The cassava, a root plant of South American origin, would provide calories for multitudes of Africans and Asians in areas previously too wet, too dry, or too infertile to support more than sparse populations. Spain's American Empire helped make it the most powerful kingdom in Europe. Soon, other European countries, Portugal, France, England, Sweden, Holland, began sending ships across the ocean to find riches of their own in America and to find a route around the continent to Asia. In 1497, just 5 years after Columbus's first voyage, John Cabot landed in North America, probably in Newfoundland, and claimed the land for the King of England. 3 years later, Portuguese sea captain Pedro Alvarez Cabral landed on the coast of Brazil, which would become an important Portuguese colony. In 1534, Jacques Cartier sailed to what is now Canada and claimed that land for France.
The biggest difference technologically between Native Americans, West Africans, and Europeans was that neither Native Americans nor West Africans could traverse large bodies of water, whereas Europeans could, and that's why Europeans came to them.
During the next century, settlers from nearly every country found their way across the Atlantic. The nations of Western Europe engaged in a fierce competition for the land and resources of the New World. After 1517, this competition among Europeans divided them by religion as well as nationality. It was in that year that German monk Martin Luther posted his 95 Theses onto the door of the Castle Church in Wittenberg and unleashed the Protestant Reformation. This split between European Christians set off a century of devastating warfare. Catholics and Protestants carried their religious wars across the Atlantic, battling each other for the gold, territory, and the souls of Native Americans. European settlers, the Native American peoples they encountered, and the African slaves they brought with them would all make their mark on the New World and on each other. Their interactions in North America would shape a new colonial society unlike any the world had ever seen before.